Back in the day, when I first started learning about cults after joining one myself, the big cults on the block were the Moonies, the Unification Church, the Children of God, the Way International, Jehovah's Witnesses. There were quite a few, and most of those had almost a commune-like experience.
You are tuning in to The Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
Join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Multiversity podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about cults, ideological totalism, and basically what happens when the mind of an individual is lost to a rigid ideology and groupthink. So we're going to talk about what is a cult, how is it possible that a leader or a group can exert so much influence over people that they can be driven to extremes, sometimes even murder and suicide. We're going to ask the questions, are cults always bad for people? And also we're going to talk a little bit about mainstream aspects of mainstream society that might be cult-like. Joining us today, we have a very special guest. After his own experience as a cult member, he went on to lead support groups for ex-cult members and affected family members. He assisted in exit counseling and deprogramming from psychologically manipulative organizations, and he's now a 30-year volunteer at Free Minds, which provides support for families and victims of psychologically manipulative organizations and cults. He also happens to be my dad, so thank you, Dad, for joining us, and welcome, John.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be a part of this.
Thanks so much for being on. So I thought I'd start off just by letting you introduce yourself a little bit and talk a little bit about your story and how you got involved in this field.
Sure. Well, it was a little over 30 years ago now. I had just gotten out of the Navy. And to give you a little backstory, I was in sort of a vulnerable place in my life, not in a bad way, but in a good way. In my younger years, I dabbled with a lot of alcohol and drugs and stuff like that. And when I was in the Navy, I got sober and I quit drinking and I started going to AA meetings. And to make a long story short, I found God. I had a life-changing experience that really helped me get free from alcohol and cigarettes and drugs and a lot of other things that I was doing in my life. And it was very transformative. And this was not long before I got out of the U.S. Navy. And so I started going to AA meetings and I went to church in the base chapel. And then 1987 came along and I was discharged. My 6 years were up and I moved back to Minneapolis and I was looking around for a church to become a part of. And I visited several, maybe a dozen. And what happened was I was at that point going to college and I was, my job was delivering pizzas at night for a friend of mine who owned a pizza place over in St. Paul. And through a friend of a friend, one of the other drivers there invited me to go to this church with him. He was telling me how great it was and how many young people there were there and how exciting and how committed everybody was. And I thought, well, this sounds great. So I went to it and he didn't do it justice. I was blown away. It was the most incredible experience I've ever had, I think, up to that point. It met on a college campus and the people there were incredible. I made more friends in 2 hours at this church service than I had since I've been back from the Navy in 2 months at all the other churches that I visited. Yeah. Everybody was super friendly. From the leaders right on down, seemed very interested in what I was doing. By the time I left that day, I'd been invited to a half a dozen different social functions. And it was great. I thought I found my home. So I kept coming back. And this church met 3 times a week. And by about the second week I was there, one of the gentlemen there asked me if I'd like to become part of a Bible study, a one-on-one Bible study. So I said, sure, that sounds good. I'd done some Bible study before, but I didn't know much about it. And I started going to these studies, and it really didn't turn out to be one-on-one. There was about 5 people who seemed to know what was going on, and me. And it wasn't like, I don't know if you guys have been to a Bible study before where you maybe read a verse and then everybody talks about it and gives their ideas what it means and stuff like that. It was different than that. It became clear after the 3rd or 4th one that they were clearly studying with me and there was an agenda here. I wasn't suspicious about it because they were such great people, and I'd already really fit in well at this church, and I was planning on continuing to do it. But after about 6 of these studies, they had proved to me by using the Bible that they were the one true church on the face of the earth. And if I ever left, I was leaving God and I was going to be destroyed and spend eternity in hell. And not only that, if I left, who would save my family and my friends and all the people I care about on the outside? And looking back, I know it sounds naive, but I was convinced, and they did this using the Bible. And what kept me there long enough for this indoctrination to take place was just how nice everybody was, and what a wonderful experience the church services was, and what a great community they had there. It really was different than anything I had experienced up to that point.
How did it, I know a little bit about this story, that it kind of became a little bit darker and more controlling over time. Like how did your experience evolve in that group?
It did. The shift was very slow, but what I first experienced as completely unconditional love, like I'd never experienced it before from a lot of people, slowly became more and more conditional. Over time, it was gradual, kind of like the frog in the boiling water, but over time, I became more and more involved and got into leadership of the group, and then I was the one, along with everybody else, who was making these services so fun for the newcomers, and I was the one doing the Bible studies with them, trying to get them in. And the control increased once I got into leadership. Everybody in the group had what they called a discipler. Any of you guys ever been in multiplying multi-level marketing?
Yeah.
Experience some of that? You might know what an upline is then.
You mean where everybody has to invite like 2 more people or something like that, or 5 more people or something like that?
Sort of like that, but my discipler was like an upline in Amway. He was somebody I reported to every day. I called him and I told him how many people I invited to church that day, how long I spent in prayer and Bible reading, how many people I met, all these different things. And it became, not right away, but within a few months, very much like a business. And it was very much like a multi-level marketing business, with religion as the driver, with the Bible as the driver. And before long, I was spending pretty much every waking minute, other than college and having a meal once in a while, recruiting or doing Bible studies with new people, trying to get them into the organization.
So about these Bible studies, I mean, it really sounds like they were very convincing, like you said. How long did it take for them to sort of, like from the first time you went to a Bible study, to sort of be convinced that, oh wow, these people are right, they actually are the one true church?
Looking back, I believe it was about 6 weeks.
Wow, that's powerful stuff.
It didn't take long, and these were Bible studies that we were having about 3 times a week once we started them. And now understand, I was not a Bible expert. That you might not be able to convince somebody who was a biblical scholar like they did me, but I knew a little bit, and I was enthusiastic about wanting to learn more. and I was pretty young. I just gotten out of the Navy, and I was idealistic, and they were able to use that to get me in.
So how much do you think your military experience affected that? Like you're already used to following orders and that sort of thing.
That's a great point. Because I've looked back on that, and I don't know if we'll discuss that at all here today, but there's a lot of groups that aren't cults that do cult-like behavior to change who you are. And I was in the Navy, so it's not as hardcore as some of the services, but they do put you through a pretty rigorous transformation in boot camp. And the goal of that is to get you to quit thinking as an individual and to start thinking as a member of a team and a member of a group. And now you're a sailor first, and you're who you are second, because you're part of a team. And there's certainly a lot of similarities. I'm not, I don't know, looking back, if that prepped me at all to be ready to join a cult like that. I don't know. Could have contributed to it, but definitely, to your point, there's a lot of the same control and milieu control and information control that they use in cults, they use in the military. The main difference is, in the military, you know that going in, and you have a set enlistment term. In a cult, there really is there's no graduation day.
Yeah, that's your whole life then at that point. You mentioned milieu control, which is one of the criteria that people often talk about for like what defines a cult. One of the things we looked into this week was Lifton's 8 criteria for like ideological totalist organizations, and milieu control was one of those things where they control what your experience is and how you experience it. How would you define what a cult is exactly? I know that's kind of a shaky definition, but what are
well,
your
you mentioned Robert Lifton's 8 criteria, and I know that book. It's part of the Thought Reform and the Psychology for Totalism. And the 8 criteria in that book do a pretty good job of laying out what you will see in a cult-like milieu. As far as the first one you mentioned, milieu control, yeah, that takes varying forms. Back in the day, when I first started learning about cults after joining one myself, the big cults on the block were the Moonies, the Unification Church, the Children of God, the Way International, Jehovah's Witnesses. There were quite a few, and most of those had almost a commune-like experience.
Are these all sort of official cults?
Well, so it's what I
guess Jehovah's Witnesses is kind of,
yeah, it's what I considered to be a cult back then. So I mean, understand it's on a continuum, right? From something where you're living in a commune, and they've got weapons to keep you from getting out. That would be on the extreme end. And there were some of the groups back then. Church Universal and Triumphant was one of the groups that actually had weapons, and it got pretty scary.
So when the group gets weapons, that's kind of that's crossing a line there.
I would say that should be a red flag if they tell you to arm yourself and take to the streets. Yeah. But the milieu control in the group I was in, it was largely information control, and but we were strongly encouraged to move in with other members. And what strongly encouraged meant is you should probably do it or you'll be viewed as a weak member. So pretty much everybody in there, unless you were married, moved in with one or more members of the group. The most common situation was about 4 people living in a house together. And that's the situation I was in. I had 3 other guys. They were all members. One of the guys had been there for 10 years, and the rest of us were fairly new. And the guy who had been there for 10 years was kind of keeping an eye on us and making sure we were on the straight and narrow. So there was control that way. But there was also information control in the sense that you began to distrust information sources outside of the group, and that was by design. So we were in a Christian cult, so obviously they talked about Satan and false teachers and all these other things, and you would think that, you know, that would be other religions and things like that, but most of the people we were warned about were other Christian churches, because they were people that would lead us astray with false teachings. And if we listened to them, you know, we were being influenced by the devil, and we might fall away, and then we'd end up going to hell, and none of our family would get saved. And so there was a lot of control that way. Also, toward the end of the time I was in about a year, they had started to get a reputation, our group did, on the U of M campus. People started saying, hey, you guys are a cult. And the word was starting to get out. So the more the word got out about us, the more warnings and the stricter the control got. If we were, you know, if anybody said we were a cult, they were labeled a wolf or a false teacher. And another one of Lifton's criteria is loaded language. There was a lot of emotionally charged language used to describe anybody outside the group, to where really, why would you want to talk to somebody like that? They're just going to lead you astray. They're going to hurt your faith. And if you allow a wolf in here, they're gonna steal the sheep and that kind of thing. Oh.
With Scientology, they call it an SP, a suppressive person, I think.
Yes, SP is, yep, that's their term for suppressive person. It's funny, when I first got out, we had many support groups, and we actually started a support group for ex-members. And the organization I volunteered for, Free Minds, had a meeting once a month to, you know, for families, for cult members who had just left, for cult members who were thinking about leaving. And they helped me a lot when I left. I mean, I was so glad they were there. But Scientology at one point tried to infiltrate the Free Minds group.
Oh my gosh.
You know, they actually sent active members to sit in on our meetings and talk to people afterwards. And I met with a few of them.
So was that rejected by the Free Minds leadership, I guess? Were they false teachers?
Well, we actually let them participate, but everybody knew they were from Scientology, so we kind of knew what they were trying to do.
Free Minds was the nonprofit for ex-cult members to like.
Sorry.
Yeah.
What was the name of the actual cult you're in?
It was called the Boston Church of Christ, also called the Multiplying Ministries. Okay. It started in Boston, Massachusetts, and eventually it got to be a worldwide movement. They had churches in 30 countries.
Wow. So I wanted to ask earlier, so what was the process for getting out? It was, I guess, at some point you must have been like, well, I guess I'm kind of in a cult. And then there must have been kind of a sort of a, what am I trying to say? Like maybe you went through some denial or something at first, and then eventually you intended to get out, and then eventually you got out. So like how long did all that take, and what was the process like?
Well, it was interesting. The guy who led the Bible study with me to get me in, led the Bible study, the one who convinced me that I wasn't really a Christian and I wasn't saved because I hadn't done all these things, and I still had, you know, sins in my life, like lustful thoughts about women and things like that. Those were all sins that you had to get rid of before you could be a true Christian. After I'd been in a while, he shared with me that he had just gotten rebaptized. And I said, why? And he said, well, I've been struggling with all these sins, this and that and the other thing. And I sort of had a little bit of a snapping moment. I thought, well, those are all the things you told me, convinced me I couldn't be a Christian when you were doing that Bible study with me. And I had a little bit of a snapping moment in my mind there. And I didn't leave right away, but I thought, okay, something's not right here. And that was the first time that I had any suspicions that anything was not right about the group I was a part of. So it opened my eyes a little bit, and I started paying more attention to what was going on.
Was he the one that you said was your upline?
He was my upline. Yeah, what they call them uplines in Amway. He was my discipler, is what they called him in the church.
Right, okay.
Yep. Still remember him to this day. I won't say his name because I don't want to mess with his anonymity. I'm not sure what he's doing now. But in fact, the group I was a part of disbanded about 7 years after I left. So they're not around anymore, but there are many others to take its place.
When you started leaving, did you face like people coming after you or any negativity there?
Quite a bit of negativity, actually. It's interesting. One of the positive things that happened to me during my year in the group was I fell in love. I met the woman who I married and who is still my wife, who's Katie's mom. And she had been in for 6 years when I joined the group. In fact, she was at the first Bible study I ever went to at the group, and we liked each other right away. And as soon as I started having questions about the group, I thought, I got to find out more. So I talked to a couple of ministers of other churches on the campus, and they knew a little bit. But I had heard of a group called the Cult Awareness Network. And so I actually splurged some money and made a long distance call. That was back in the day before cell phones. And I called the Cult Awareness Network. And the guy on the other end, he was great. He talked to me for about 20 minutes, and he just asked me some questions about what I was doing, what the group was like, and what why I was calling and stuff like that. And he finally said, from what you're describing, is this group affiliated with Boston at all? And I said, yeah, the parent church is the Boston Church of Christ. And he said, oh my gosh, get out of there. He says, that's one of the most well-known cults in the country right now. He says it's been kicked off of half the college campuses in the nation. And he said, give me your address. I'll send you a bunch of information about them. And here, read this book and read that book. And so it was like the scales were falling from my eyes, right? And they sent me all this info, and I read it. And I read the book Combating Cult Mind Control that Steve Hassan had written. And I was still in the group at this point, but I was planning to leave, but I didn't want to leave Teresa, and I didn't want to leave my friends in there. So I thought, I got to tell them why I'm leaving. And so I did. I told Mark, and then I called Teresa and I told her, look, I've found some things out about the church, and I've read some books, and I talked to the Cult Awareness Network, and I'm going to take a break, and can we get together for coffee and I can show you some of this stuff that I'm looking at? And she said, I'm never speaking to you again, and hung up the phone. And
wow, ouch.
And immediately, I found out later that everybody in the group was told immediately at that point, do not talk to John. And so I was what they call marked. And that was an official thing. I'd heard of other people being marked in the group. And that means that they've either become a wolf or they become a false teacher. You shouldn't talk to them. You should stay away from them. It's too serious. Don't even go try to get them back in. They're too far gone. And that's what happened to me. And and Teresa was true to her word on that for several months until over Thanksgiving of that year. Her parents had suspicions about the group for a long time, and I had met them. And when I got out, I let her parents know that I left because they knew me, and they asked why, and I told them. And they were so relieved. They thought, we knew there was something wrong with this group, because Teresa and her twin brother Tom had been in there for 6 years and had pretty much cut off all communications with their parents. They saw them about once a year. And so from that, they did a little more research. They talked to the Cult Awareness Network. They ended up hiring a deprogrammer, and they actually did a kidnapping and deprogramming on Teresa and her brother over Thanksgiving of that year.
Whoa.
What's the legality of that?
Yeah.
That sounds really intense.
The legality, it was totally illegal, absolutely illegal what they did, because they were both adults. A minor you can do that too, but they did it, and that kind of thing still does happen. It's rare, but deprogrammings do still take place. So the good news coming out of that story was within 4 months of Therese being deprogrammed, we were married, and been together. It'll be 30 years in February. So
It's a really wild story.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
pretty incredible.
Maybe this would be a good time to talk about this question, actually, since we touched a little bit on.
I think Ariel has been trying to jump in a couple times there. Were you? I saw your face come on, and then
Yeah. Okay.
Ariel.
I just wanted to ask, what takes place during a deprogramming? What is a deprogramming?
Well, the ones I've been a part of, and it's been many years since I was actually in an involuntary deprogramming, but what normally happens, and what happened with my wife, was her parents invited her out with a false pretense to have dinner, and they had dinner with her and talked and pretended everything was fine. And then on the way home, they didn't take her home. They took her to a house of some friends where a deprogrammer was waiting. And once she got there, she was extremely resistant, which is usually the case in an involuntary deprogramming. I wouldn't recommend it at all for people. But what happens in a deprogramming, just like a voluntary exit counseling, is you're exposed to information. And usually deprogramming can take anywhere from 3 to 5 days. And the first day is usually simply information about cults. You would see movies, you would hear the deprogrammer talking, you would hear readings from books. Basically, you would learn everything in Lifton's 8 criteria. You would learn everything out of Steve Hassan's Combating Cult Mind Control. There's some films that were shown in, one of them was called Ticket to Heaven, about a young man who was recruited into the Moonies. There was another one called, let's see, what was it? I'll think of the other one later, but the first day is usually just movies, films, pretty innocuous information, trying to give the person a general idea of what cults are and how they work. And most often the person is very resistant during this time. So they're usually just sitting there with an angry face. And that's what Teresa was doing during this period of time, was just sitting there looking real angry. But the ones I've been involved in, usually by the second or third day of education about how cults work, enough of it starts to sink in where the person will start asking some questions and interacting with the deprogrammer. And at that point, what the deprogrammer is trying to do is access the pre-cult self. And the pre-cult self is it's just you.
I was just going to say, so you do this work now?
I haven't done a deprogramming in years, but or a voluntary exit counseling. But I did do that work for about 10 years after I left the group.
Wow,
And because at that point I was so grateful to be out, and I really wanted to give something back, that I was probably as zealous about trying to get people out as I was trying to get people in when I was in it. And probably overzealous, I would say, at times. I wouldn't do an involuntary deprogramming at this point in my life. The only way I could justify it ethically would, if I knew somebody was in a suicide cult or something, I would do it then.
Is involuntary deprogramming usually successful? Involuntary
deprogramming and voluntary exit counseling, I've seen for people who last the full at least 3 days in it, what I've seen is about a 2/3 success rate. And by success rate, I mean that the person by the end of the 3 days is willing to seek out more information on their own and continue to research the other side of the story. Not everybody is willing to make a commitment that they're never going back right away, but most people, after a 3-day exit counseling or intervention, will at least make a commitment to continue to research more information.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wanted to go over Lifton's 8 criteria quickly, just because we've referred to them a lot, and I think this might help give some more context to cults in general. Robert J. Lifton was somebody who actually did research like in the 50s, and he published a book in the 60s about the tactics used by the Communist Party in China to recruit people. And he talked about 8 criteria for these types of groups that he called ideologically totalist, and that was kind of one of the first pieces of cult research. The first criteria he talked about is milieu control, which we've touched on a little bit, which is basically where you're controlled information and space that you're in. Loaded language, like special language and terminology, like lingo of the group that helps them control the mind a little bit. Mystical manipulation. That was another, like, planned miraculous events, and like ways that they make the group seem as though it's directly connected to God or directly connected to something else.
Yes, if I might interject here.
Sure.
Mystical manipulation, when you're in a cult or a highly controlling group, they have the rights of determination for all coincidences. Basically, life happens, right? You have flat tires, your kitchen starts on fire, people have serious illnesses, life happens. But when you're in one of these groups, the leadership they determine for you the meaning of that. And everything means something when you're in one of these groups. So if you say you get a flat tire on your car and you're stuck all night, well, if you're in the group and you're a member in good standing, the reason for that would be explained to be, well, that was God. He wanted you to witness or share with the people who stopped to help you fix that tire. The exact same event would be interpreted as God's judgment upon you for leaving the group if it was somebody who left. So depending on how they want to how they want to interpret the event, they have the rights of first refusal for anything mystical.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. The next one they talk about is sacred science, which is kind of what you were talking about, how they use kind of, I guess you could say, logic to prove that they have the one truth. Demand for purity is another criteria. Mm-hmm. Confession, doctrine over person, which is basically if there's a discrepancy between what you feel or observe and what the doctrine says, then you're definitely wrong. The doctrine is always right. And finally, dispensing of existence, which is where the truth or whatever this organization is becomes more important than life itself, especially life of people who are outside the group.
Yes, and dispensing of existence, also the leaders of the group decide who has a right to exist and who doesn't, or who has value and who doesn't. So group members, potential recruits, people who are sympathetic toward your organization, all have great value. Critics, ex-members, especially ex-members, in any competing organizations all have very, very little value and very little right to exist.
One thing I was wondering, looking through these, like you were talking about in your time with this group, you were in university, and it seems to me that that could be maybe like a crack in the milieu control because you have like this other source of information coming in. So I was curious, how did the group like frame what you were getting in through the university, like your studies?
Oh, good question. Yeah, it's a good point because a lot of the people in our group were from current students at the University of Minnesota. In fact, Teresa, who's my wife and Katie's mom, was the lead campus women's recruiter on the University of Minnesota. So she was in charge of recruitment on that campus. And it's interesting because a lot of our members were very bright and they were very engaged in their studies. But once you join, your academic studies really became secondary. You still went to school. I was still in college while I was in the group, but the importance of the college and what I was studying in there greatly diminished. It was really strange. I don't remember anybody ever telling me that it wasn't of value, but it just lost importance. And it really did for people in there. One of the things that I noticed and didn't think about until after I left was I hardly knew what anybody in the group did for a living or what their major was. And that's strange. I mean, I know those things about my other friends. I know those things about my friends outside the group, but I didn't know those things about my friends when I was in there because the only thing that was really important was the group and what we were doing and what we were about.
Interesting. So I guess, did your grades did your grades kind of suffer because you weren't putting as much work into them?
They did. My grades suffered quite a bit when I was in there. And I remember I did study, but I didn't have the passion for it like I did before. I had the passion for doing stuff with my friends in the group and being at services and stuff like that. And there was also, not overtly, but you sort of felt like any time you spent doing stuff that wasn't furthering the group's agenda was being selfish.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to what you were talking about, how sort of circumstantial events like getting a flat tire would be attributed to God or attributed to something in your life. I have this kind of like anti-culty reflex, I think, where I hear somebody say something and it just like sets off this trigger in my brain where I'm like, I don't want to be near that. And I think one of the things that does it for me is when somebody does that, like just somebody, something happens, just something unlucky happens to somebody and somebody goes, oh, the Lord, wanted this to happen. Or the Lord is, I don't know, like they're bringing in some kind of like mystical explanation. And I'm just like, so I just have like this revulsion against that.
I share that revulsion with you now.
Yeah.
At one time I didn't.
I mean, it seems to me, though, that like it's not necessarily the mystical aspect that's toxic there, because you could have a situation where, like in the example of like Chinese communism, you could have the example of like every flat tire is in some way explained by the ideology, or every circumstance of life is explained by Marxism or the bourgeois oppression. And like you could have, like it seems like the issue is that a single ideological lens is being applied to every single event of life in a totalizing way, like not necessarily that it's mystical in nature.
You're absolutely right. At least that's been my experience, because I mean, I happen to be from a religious cult, and that's what I was susceptible to at that point in my life, because I'd just quit drinking and I was going to AA and they talk about God there, and I was going to church. So that was something I was susceptible to. I just retired recently from a 30-year career in IT, so I kind of look at everything through a nerd IT mode. And so a Christian cult, that was something that was was really compatible with my operating system at that point. So, I might have been running at that point Windows 3.1, and that Christian cult ran really good on there. But maybe you're a Mac, or maybe you're something else. But you know what I found? There's a cult that'll run on almost anybody's operating system. But you may not be susceptible to a Christian cult, but maybe what you mentioned, Ariel, a Chinese communist cult, or any kind of a political cult or a marketing cult, an Eastern guru cult, like I think you guys are going to talk about later.
Yeah. There's a lot of different kinds of cults, from political to, I think spiritual and religious cults are maybe a little bit easier because they allow you to have those kinds of transformative experiences and attribute it to God. And like, God is a very powerful concept, but for a lot of people, I think political ideology can serve a similar role, or in some environmentalist groups, you see some cult-like behavior maybe in some social justice groups these days. Like there's lots of different types.
Yeah. It seems to me that all of these kind of culty organizations are exploiting weaknesses in people's operating systems. I guess, we are drawn to, I think, sort of organizations of people who share our values, and working together with those people to do something meaningful. And so, like, the thing about a cult is that, like, I guess if you get kind of sucked up into one, you're doing it because it's really positive for you at the time. It's doing something good for you. I think that's probably most people's motivation for joining a cult. And it's just, you just don't know the nature of the organization when you first get involved, and eventually you find out. But by then, maybe it's too late.
That's an excellent point, because they do something. I shared about how much I enjoyed my first visit to the group that I ended up joining, and how many friends I made, and it was an incredible experience. And they were doing things, at least they said they were at that time, to help the community and to help the people in the city. And it hooked into my want for friendship. So it did all those good things for me. And it hooked into my idealism of wanting to help other people. And most of these groups, I mean, with few exceptions, are positive appeal. They're going after young, smart, idealistic people. And I was talking to somebody that it might even been Katie the other day, I'm not sure, but the only person I don't know who might not be susceptible to one of these would be a true sociopath who just wouldn't care.
Is there a way to like vaccinate yourself? Like we were talking about the different people's operating systems are susceptible to different kinds of cults. Is there a way to be like, I don't want to be a cult member. I don't want to be a sociopath either. Like, how do I vaccinate my operating system against cults?
Oh, well, you guys are doing it now. I mean, the fact that you read these things, that Lifton's 8 criteria, I'm not sure what other material you read, but educate yourself as much as you can. I knew very, very little about cults when I joined the one I was in. I'd heard of groups that I thought were cults back then, Hare Krishna and the Moonies, but I didn't know anything. And so educating yourself and becoming you don't have to be an expert, but just well-versed on what they do and how they work will help you to recognize it when you get into a situation where you start to feel something's a little off. Have any of you had that yourselves?
I've had a bunch of experiences. So I've been in, like you mentioned, Amway. I have been in Amway, but I was also a member of another sales organization, it's called Cobra in Australia, but in the US and Canada, I think it's called DS Max, or Direct Sales Max. And they do certain things like, well, they get you very excited. They're always trying to pump people up, and you're sleep deprived because they're working you so hard. Like they try to keep you for, 8 hours in the field and an extra 4 hours in the office and that sort of thing. And then there's that isolationism, like they try to, because you're working so much, you can't see your friends and family that much. I was also, I went to Landmark. You know Landmark?
Landmark Forum?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
So there's Landmark, and there's also EST, which is where it came from, I guess. And then there's another one which an acquaintance of ours is involved in. It's called Avatar, and that descends from EST as well. And so it's like a weekend-long retreat, and again, everybody's very excited, and sleep deprivation and isolationism again. So,
Yes.
but I never got too sucked into it, I guess. So I did benefit from all of these organizations in one way or another, but I didn't go all the way.
Yes, and the groups you mentioned I've heard of, and they're borderline. Some people consider them cults, and some people don't. If you get fully involved in those, you'll eventually find yourself being an evangelist and a recruiter for those organizations, and trying to get all your friends in, and maybe even going out and trying to recruit people you don't know into it. And that's one of the red flags when you get to that point.
I haven't been sucked directly into a cult-like organization that was top down, but I have had personal experience with having like an ideology kind of take over your mindset. And for me, it was with libertarianism and voluntarism, which are, still ideas that are very dear to me and that I take a lot of influence and benefit from. But there was a point in my life where everything that I heard was filtered through the non-aggression principle. And if anything bad happened, it was because the government was causing it. And I can understand the mindset of someone who's in that. And you could say that I was a little bit of a cult leader myself, I suppose. Like I definitely helped other people get into that mindset as well, but there was no organization behind it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Ideologies can be kind of culty, and the people leading the ideologies can become kind of like cults of personality, I guess, where they're kind of just, like there will be this like party line, and they'll say a thing, and everybody will be like, yeah, and then you're sitting there going, that's not right.
Chris has been to my cult before, so
Indeed. It was the friendliest.
Did you join?
I tried. I don't think they wanted me to join.
Yeah, speaking of political,
I asked too many questions.
Speaking of political groups, I have a cute story for you. One of the voluntary interventions we were in was with it was a 70-year-old couple, husband and wife, just the sweetest couple, grandpa and grandma. And they had joined, you may not have heard of him, this was back in the day, but Lyndon LaRouche. He ran for president a few times, and he had an organization, a political organization that was very cult-like. It became very cult-like. And this nice grandpa and grandma had gotten sucked into this thing. And so we talked to him. It only took a day, and we showed him some information. And so what they were told about Lyndon LaRouche was that he had the plan to save America from all the terrible things that were happening to it. But the problem was Lyndon LaRouche was in prison, and the government had put him there, and they were sitting on all the evidence and all the truth that would save America. So they were joining Lyndon LaRouche's group to try to save America. And they had given them their entire retirement savings, which was about $70,000 they had given to the Lyndon LaRouche organization. And this was all the money this little old lady and little old man had. And it was very sad, but they weren't even bitter about it. By the end of the day, when they realized they'd been taken, the woman just said, "Those stinkers, they got us." It was just the cutest thing ever. And so they didn't go back.
So that's a pretty adorable example of one thing. I know we wanted to talk a little bit about Jim Jones and Jonestown, which was probably one of the most extreme cult examples out there. Jim Jones led the People's Temple, which was an ostensibly Christian church, although it's disputed whether he actually even believed in God. That the main tenets of it were like racial integration, and he started promoting like communism and socialism later. And I think most people have heard the story about how they ended up creating a commune in Guyana, and there was a lot of mind control, Jim Jones's voice playing over the speakers 24/7. And when a congressman came to visit to see if people were there voluntarily or not, because family members were concerned, the congressman ended up being assassinated, and then the group committed mass suicide or mass suicide / mass murder. It's kind of disputed whether everyone drank the Kool-Aid voluntarily there. And that's like a really dark example, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about how is that possible? Like, how can a person or a group exert so much influence over a group of people that they would willingly commit mass suicide or kill other people? Like, this was on the scale of 900 people died in Guyana that day.
Yes, we did a lot of reading about that, and you talked about some of the positive things cults do, and Jim Jones was an example of that, because only in stages and in degrees did it get to the point of paranoia and control that allowed them to commit mass suicide. Early on, Jim Jones was providing free housing for people in California and some of the poorest districts ever, gotten a lot of people off the streets and into places to live. They did a lot of good. And yes, his ideology was largely communist. And in addition to that, when cultic teachings and when people did start to leave and report about the group, Jim Jones was very tied into politics locally in California. So they kind of had his back. And so a lot of things went, unreported, and he got away with a lot more than most cults would have. By the time they moved to Guyana, it was only his most devout followers that followed him there, understandably. Mm-hmm. And my understanding of what happened there, Leo Ryan, the congressman who went over there to visit, was actually there in part to do a wellness check on the people that were living there with Jim Jones. And a lot of people wanted to leave at that point, and they asked Congressman Ryan to take them with him. And that ratcheted up the paranoia and caused Congressman Ryan to be killed. And it wasn't too long after that the suicides happened.
Yeah, it seems to me that a lot of sort of culty organizations that end in tragedy. Another one is the one that's highlighted in Wild Wild Country, the Rajneeshees. It seems like they do start out as super positive organizations that are doing all of this, outreach. The Rajneeshees had a program for, they would go around with buses, and they would like gather up all the homeless people, bring them all to the commune in Oregon. And they were all these homeless people were like, I finally have, a job. I finally have something meaningful to do with my lives. And of course they were being used as political pawns, but they didn't know. But it seems to me that a lot of these cult-like organizations start out, at least, maybe even the founders are basically well-meaning people, and they're just trying to get a bunch of people together who share values, as I was saying before. And then I think this kind of happened with Jim Jones and the Rajneeshees, where basically they start having problems with outside groups. Like in the case of the Rajneeshees, that they moved to this compound in Oregon, and the local residents were like, who are all these people from like all over the world and India, and they're doing these weird religious things, and they had this conflict with the locals. Whereas with the People's Church, it was more just a conflict with, I guess, this senator. It was kind of the sort of triggering event. But there's usually this line that happens. That sort of kicks off this spiral downwards into paranoia and increasing amounts of control, increasing amounts of oppression on the members, until finally, something tragic happens. But it seems to me that if some of these kind of organizations that we're not really sure if they're cults or not, it seems like they have this kind of balance with the outside community, where they keep enough stuff secret and people are having an okay enough time that the I guess sort of outside external forces are not intent on destroying the organization, or the organization doesn't see it that way, because I think that's maybe even more important.
Yes. Yeah, you mentioned the dividing line. You'll probably remember this group too. Do you remember David Koresh?
Absolutely.
Yes, he started a group called the Branch Davidians, and they started out doing a lot of positive things too, and became more and more isolated, eventually moving to a compound in Waco, Texas. And it was back during the Clinton administration on the standoff with Janet Reno and the FBI outside the Waco compound. And that was clearly the triggering event for what they did, which was a mass suicide. David Koresh told his followers, he'd been telling them for years that they were the branch, they were the one true remnant of the church, and Armageddon was going to come to them. So when all of a sudden his compound is surrounded by the FBI, he told his followers that was Armageddon.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jim Jones had done some prep for his followers as well, like even doing kind of mock mass suicides. There was one incident that some of the survivors reported where before the actual mass suicide where people drank poisoned KoolAid or Flavor Aid, that he convinced people that they were drinking poisoned Flavor Aid just to see if they would do it. And ran some...
It was strange, though. Actually, it's from what it said in the documentary in Jonestown, Life and Death of People's Temple, it sounded like he actually told them after they drank it. So it was like, it wasn't even to test their compliance. It was just to see how much they'd freak out or something, or like a retrospective compliance or something. I found it really funny in that documentary as well, when the congressman came, and there's a quote from a guy who was talking to him and warning him, and he said, "Don't worry, the shield of Congress will protect me and will protect us." And it was like this supreme irony, because you come here to investigate a cult, but you have this like magical thinking in your own brain.
Yeah,
I hadn't heard that.
So it seems like frog and boiling water kind of situations, increasing control of any information coming in can lead to a situation where the leader or the group basically controls the whole mindset and thought processes of the members and can get them to do anything. Like, is that kind of how you guys would characterize it?
Yeah, and I think what happens towards the end of the life cycle, if there is an end, is the leader becomes so identified with the group that if the leader sees that the group is gonna be disbanded, the leader has all of this power over all of those people, and I'm sure they usually get paranoid, like, oh, if I go to jail, I'm not going to have this great power anymore, and so they feel like they're somehow entitled to destroy the group and everyone in it, rather than have this other outcome where they're just kind of alone in jail.
Yes, and I think a lot of the ones that have done that, their teachings include visions of a perfect afterlife, and something that the members might not even see death as something to be feared. I think it would be less likely to happen. A suicide cult would be less likely to happen in a political cult or a human potential movement cult than it would in a cult that has a strong emphasis on the afterlife.
That makes a lot of sense. Speaking of the human potential movement, and we touched a little bit on the Rajneeshees, which Rajneeshpuram was a commune run by the man who was then known as Bhagwan Rajneesh and now is known as Osho. He's still a pretty popular spiritual leader and author. And I kind of wanted to talk about with that one and just in general, are cults always, I don't think these groups are necessarily always bad for people. Like it seems like there's a lot of positive that comes, especially out of some of these personal development or spiritual groups that can sometimes turn into cults. So maybe we could talk about some of the positive aspects of these communities who are riding that line.
Yeah, I mean, so Rajneeshees, the Rajneeshees are a perfect example of this. I mean, that documentary that Netflix released, Wild Wild Country, is just a bunch of interviews with people who used to be in it. And they didn't see it as a cult, you know, they, you know, it's 20 years or 30 years later. And a lot of them are still very, very positive about it. They're like, yeah, we were doing these really great things. And, you know, and basically, you know, the Oregonians were just out to get us, you know? And so you really see both sides of the story in that documentary. It's a really fascinating production.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. A lot of people do leave the streets. You know, a lot of times cults are what helps them do it. So if a person is homeless, if a person is drug addicted, if they don't have a job, if they're living on the streets, and they join a cult, and all of a sudden they're employed, they have a new outlook on life, they give up drugs, they give up alcohol, are they really worse off? In some cases, I think no. So yeah, to your point, Katie, I think there are times where, I mean, clearly cults do some positive things. And for some people in some situations, leaving one, it might not always be the best.
That makes sense. I was thinking when I was kind of doing research on cults and watching some of these videos, I wonder if cults are kind of an extreme example, but it seems like they're serving a need that might be kind of lacking in normal Western society or US society or Australian society, which is kind of the feeling of a tribe and meaning and purpose and like an extended family and community that you're all working towards the same goal. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I don't know if we really have it. I don't think most people have that. So maybe when they come into contact with a cult, it's feeding on these very human desires and, you know, kind of how we evolved living for millennia.
Yeah, well, I think about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and there's a lot of those things when you join a cult, it seems to like just tick all those boxes, like so many things lighting up, like sense of community, sense of purpose, respect among your peers, and even peak experiences, which is supposed to be one of the highest things, because you feel like John mentioned when he first came in there, he was blown away. And in the Wild Wild Country documentary, one of the fellows says the same thing about the Rajneesh community.
Yeah. Do you think that it's kind of a natural tendency for humans to want to be in groups like this?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head that, you know, something is wrong with our society. And I think that cults are a reflection of that. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, you know, as Nietzsche predicted, you know, with the death of God, you know, comes all of this crisis of meaning. And, you know, I think there is something in our biology that Maslow's hierarchy of needs describes, you know, that causes us to seek out a community where we can belong, where we can have self-esteem, where we can do something meaningful, something worthwhile. So yeah, I think cults are a kind of exploitation of our natural drive for those things, which our society at large is failing to provide.
I guess one thing I'm wondering is like, it seems like there's a few ways that people could join communities or find some pathways to meaning. And I'm wondering like, what's the difference between a cult and, and between joining a cult and joining like a normal non-cult church? Like, is a cult offer like an easier, is it like an easy, like you don't have to work as hard to get those things in the hierarchy of needs, maybe?
How do you, I think telling the difference between a cult and a non-cult church can be sometimes a little bit difficult. I think it just depends on like the level of, I would say a cult is more all-encompassing than a church. So if you're trying to dive into a community and dive into meaning, a cult would give you probably a richer, and like Dad said, when he first went to that Bible study, it was like one of the most amazing experiences of his life. It's going to give you like a deeper, richer, more all-encompassing lifestyle experience, as opposed to a church, which is more limited, and that's probably healthier to have it more limited.
Yeah, and I think Kurt mentioned like peak experiences. I think that's one of those things that cults provide a little bit better than regular churches, because like precisely what's happening that's dangerous is the thing that provides the peak experience, and that is the sort of ego death, like the losing yourself in this thing that's bigger than you. I think that can be very powerful, almost like a drug for people. And I think that regular churches, always, the individual, kind of always stays intact. You always kind of, it's a conversation between you and the community and God or whatever. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been to regular churches before and since, non-cult churches and different organizations. But I'll have to say, even though it was 30 years ago, I don't think I've had a period of time where I've had that much singleness of purpose, focus, and intensity, and knowing that you know that you know that you know when you're in a cult. There's something about it. It's very heady, and and I think Annabelle asked one of the difference. How do you know? I know one of the main things you'll never see in a cult that you will see in a healthy church or a healthy organization is, in a healthy organization, there's a graceful way to leave. I can move on to a new experience and still be friends with you if you're in the group I just left. If you're in a cult, you can't do that. And the other big thing about joining a cult is you have to go through a cognitive and foundational shift in your thoughts and beliefs to join. We didn't mention this one, but I know there's a psychologist named Leon Festinger who has a theory called the cognitive dissonance theory. And cognitive dissonance is when your behavior and your thoughts and emotions are misaligned. You're doing things that you don't fully believe, or you're being told things that contradict something that you deeply believe, and you're fighting with it. You're at war with yourself, and you go through that and come out on the other side when you join a cult. To experience that on a small scale, you've all experienced being around a high pressure salesperson, right? You're there, it's a product you really can't afford, but part of you really wants it to, and you're fighting with yourself. Hey, I really want to get this thing, but I really can't afford it, and I really should not do this, but I really want it, and it's just uncomfortable, and I'm fighting. Okay, I'm going to do it. And once you do that, okay, I'm going to do it, all of a sudden you're aligned again. You may have made a good choice or a bad choice, but you're aligned in that new orientation. You've gone through that change and that battle with yourself. You fought through that dissonance and come out on the other side. And when you join a cult, you really do that because your foundational beliefs are challenged right down to the core of your being, and it's intense. That's why some of the groups like to get you away for a weekend for a seminar, really intense, very little sleep, 16 hours a day, putting you through. And because you're going to experience some intense dissonance in that experience. And if you break through to the other side, you're going to feel great. You're going to feel completely aligned and kind of on a high. And that's how I was feeling when I joined that group. And you don't get that walking into a regular church. And there is something about me that likes that. I don't know if it's something about everybody, but I sure liked it.
I can relate to that feeling as well, and with ideology.
I think that's a pretty universal attraction for people.
Especially it's an intellectual attraction. If you feel like you're wrestling with an idea and then you let yourself go, like it's like the process of having an epiphany or having a breakthrough.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of that process of buying a product. It is kind of an intellectual thing too, because it's like when you don't have before you've bought into something, you're in the state of like weighing all these different complex considerations, and like there's no clear answers, and it's hard and it's unpleasant. But when you believe fully in a totalizing perspective, and suddenly everything makes sense, everything is aligned, like it feels very good. Like it feels very cleansing in a way.
It does. And it shows the power that words and ideas can have. I mean, if you think about it, the advertising industry, it's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry based on the idea that they can influence us in a 30-second commercial to make a decision and part with our money.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in 30 seconds of being influenced with some words and maybe some cute pictures on a screen. But when you go through a cult recruitment process, you might be in a 3-day commercial. And once you make that cognitive shift, then you're in a lifetime commercial. And you slowly cut off any information that's contrary to what the ideology of the group. And pretty soon, you're programming yourself. And you're doing the commercial for others.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with what you were talking about before earlier, John, with the whole, you said something that hit me. It was, you know that you know that you know. Yep. And I think what the cult is doing is it's tapping into trust, right? People, when we go through our lives and we're questioning and doubting everything, you know, we don't like being permanently in that situation because we can't really trust anything, right? We want to have some truth or some people or something that we can just place our trust in and just kind of you know, let that thing be our anchor, you know, like let that thing be our like our source of confidence in the world. You know, maybe I don't know everything, but at least I know this. And I think the longer that you spend aligned like that, the more it builds trust, right? And this is how the process of building trust works. You know, you start out and you slowly, you know, become aligned with that thing. And then the more you become aligned with that thing, the more you trust it. And the more you trust it, the better you feel and the more you're able to trust it in the future. And I think another thing is that if you see that other people are trusting it too, and you share values with these people and you like these people, then it's like it reinforces it even more. And so it's this kind of like as you said, this kind of self-reinforcing mechanism. I think it is possible to achieve that with just regular religion or with maybe other ideologies that aren't as destructive. But I think that cults kind of shortcut the process.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like a shortcut to extreme meaning and community and everything like that. But in so doing, you're giving up freedom of ideas and sometimes freedom of your own body if you get into an extreme situation where you're not even physically allowed to leave.
Have you guys seen Star Trek? Sorry, I don't know if this is going to derail it, but you guys know the Borg?
Oh yeah, the Borg Collective. I love that episode.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so there's a bunch of episodes, and one of the ones that stuck with me was where in Voyager, I don't know if you've seen that one, where they break 7 of 9 out of the Borg collective, and this is like exactly reminding me of the whole deprogramming process, right? Because the Borg is this hive mind, right? It's this place where, you know, they assimilate you, and then you just get hooked in to the hive consciousness. And so when they break 7 of 9 out, she's like, I can't stand this. Where are the voices? They're gone. I only have my own voice. I only have my own thoughts. This is terrible. I have no sense of meaning or purpose. And so, you know, they take, you know, like the whole season or more to kind of convince her that, no, actually, you know, freedom is nice, you know, like being able to make your own choices is great, you know, like she was like, you know, but of course, you know, when she first leaves the collective, she's like, no, but that's so much of a burden. Like, I just want decisions to be made for me, you know. I don't like all of this uncertainty and freedom and stuff, but, you know, eventually she gets used to it. It's basically an involuntary deprogramming. So
No, I want to watch that one.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to make sure that we touched on this just in case there was anybody with a friend or family member or like someone that they were concerned about getting sucked too deeply into an idea or a group. I know you don't recommend involuntary deprogrammings. What would you recommend if you know somebody that's that might be getting caught or maybe is caught?
Yeah, it's actually most of what I do now is, you know, I answer emails for the Free Minds website, and most of it's families who email and say, hey, my kid's in this or that, or my husband's in this and that, or my wife's in this and that. And what I mostly tell them now is first to educate themselves, to learn as much about as they can about how cults work and how they operate, learn as much as they can about the group that their loved one is in, but definitely do not call it a cult to your loved one. Do not tell them they're brainwashed. Do not do anything like that. Nothing confrontive, because at least most of the cults that I had direct experience with prep their members for that kind of thing. The group I was in told, you know, since it was a Christian cult, the attacks were going to be motivated by Satan, right? So Satan's going to work through your loved ones and tell you that this is a cult, and they're going to try to pull you out of this, and they're going to say you're brainwashed. And then when they do that, well, they're making the group seem even more prophetic. Oh, wow, the group said they were going to do this, and here they are doing it. So really just educate yourself and learn as much as you can, and just show as much genuine interest in what your loved one is involved in as you can, to keep that. I think it was Chris that talked about trust. You have to keep the bridge of trust open, because the thing, who knows if they're in a real cult or not, they might be or they might not be, but if you suspect your loved one is, you're scared. But keeping that bridge of trust open, because the thing that the cults do very well is they like to what's called poisoning the wells. So that's an Old Testament term where you poison all the wells. So any place anybody would go other than the group, it's bad. You can't drink the water there. So when you're deep into one of these, you get this mindset, like, even if you do have a doubt or think you'd want to leave, but where would I go anyway? Every place else is corrupt. They're this or they're that, and I don't trust my parents think I'm brainwashed, and they think I'm a cult, and they, I can't talk to them. So as much as you can keep that bridge of communication open, because really, I don't even know if I should say this, people don't stay in these things forever. They don't. I mean, with exceptions. There are people that stay in them for 20 or 30 years. But the half-life for people in most of these things is less than 10 years. And they end up leaving on their own. And what they need most then is people they still trust on the outside that they can go to and get support from. Because if they're living in a communal group, it's a big step. I mean, my wife's parents deprogrammed her and got her out, and I was there to help her and stuff like that. But if you're living in a communal group, and all your friends are there and your job is part of that group and everything, it's a huge risk leaving. So keep the lines of communication open. Don't burn the bridges. As much as you'd want to, it's counterintuitive, because the thing you want to do when your loved one's in there is just shake them and say, wake up, snap out of it, you're in a cult. And that just doesn't work. If it got to the point where you suspected that they were in a suicide group or something really, really dangerous, then you could look into deprogramming or voluntary intervention. And I would recommend trying voluntary intervention first. That's more like a chemical dependency intervention you would do with an alcoholic or somebody. And we've done many of those where all the family members and friends get together and you just make an emotional appeal to the person. Will you just please stay for a couple days and listen to the other side of the story for us, and you hope you've still got enough emotional capital with the person that they'll say yes to something like that. So most cases, 9 out of 10 never needs to come to that.
Wow. Yeah, that's kind of scary stuff. Like thinking about being cut off so much that they might not be willing to listen or listen at all to the other side. Yeah. Oh, well, thanks for that. I just wanted to make sure we got that in. We talked about this a little bit though, with some parallels with the military. I was wondering if you've given any thought to some cult-like aspects of mainstream culture, or if any of us had any ideas on that. Like,
you guys follow U.S. politics at all?
Sure.
Yeah, one thing I noticed in the Lifton text, he talks about shortcut terms for things. So it's like newspeak, which George Orwell talked about in 1984. And, sometimes I'll be in a political conversation with somebody and talking about some concept, and they'll say, you're just a neoliberal. You're just like Thatcher or Reagan. And I'm like, I didn't say anything about that. And then they go on as if I'm Reagan or something. What am I doing?
Yeah, you can tell kind of like which ideology people are in on the internet by they'll just drop these little terms, and then you're like, okay, now I have to go Google that.
Yeah. Different ideologies definitely have their own like lingo. I'm trying to think if I can think of a good example.
I mean, if you want just like examples of mainstream things that have been called cults, I'm in like a bunch of them. I'm sure you've heard of CrossFit. I'm sure you've heard of yoga. I'm sure you've heard of Bitcoin. These things have all been basically called cults by people who are kind of jokingly, like they're not, basically the people who are in them are really enthusiastic about them, and they tend to try and recruit all of their friends to join. And that's how I was for all of those things. Actually, when I first joined, I was like, this is the best thing ever. You have to come try this. And people are like, whoa, why are you so enthusiastic about this? But yeah, all of them have kind of like their own little like inside language that they speak. So like CrossFit, you have boxes and you have WODs and you have AMRAPs and stuff. And with yoga, you have like kind of woo stuff, like your
chakras and your
like they'll just say something to the other person, and like when two people have been in the yoga scene, I guess, for a while, and you're new, and you'll just hear a conversation between two of those people, and you're just like, what are they talking about? like is my my spirit is aligned with yours, or something like that, or my how are your vibrations doing today, or how like are you feeling centered, or something like that. I don't know, Kurt. Yeah, I know you know all of that lingo, I guess.
No, I would never say anything like that.
I'm sure you've heard stuff like that.
Not really.
I guess though, again, it's like I don't like those concepts in and of themselves don't necessarily seem like they'd be cult-like. It seems like the aspects that's cult-like is like the totalitarianism of different belief systems, at least as far as I can see.
Yeah, I don't think those concepts are necessarily cult-like, but they might share some similar aspects. Like, especially you see this in politics, like even relatively innocuous mainstream politics. There's lingo that people will use, and like I was trying to think of an example. This one is pretty innocuous. Like if somebody talks about the concept of privilege and uses the word privilege, they're probably on the left, and you can probably like assume a lot of their belief system based on the fact that they're using just that word. Or like if somebody talks about freedom or specifically liberty, if someone uses the word liberty, they're probably on the right. Like, yeah, and you can really tell, and like these societies are trickle down economics. Well, trickle down economics is usually used in like a negative context. Like these people might even talk about the same. They might even talk about the same values, but like someone on the left might say something like personal expression and fulfillment, and maybe they'll say like freedom, but someone on the right would say like individual liberty. And you can just tell what kind of clan they're in. Like you can tell it by the way people dress, and I don't know.
And it doesn't necessarily make these things cults, but it's the fact that we can recognize this tendency about humans. This is where you can see the exploit, like you can see the target. And when the cult comes along, they start taking advantage of this. Like in the Landmark Forum, they talk about, I can't even remember. They talk about your foundation and your I can't remember what Scientology. It's anagrams or something like this, and body thetans and stuff like that. So they take advantage of the fact that you like to use these shortcut terms to get at ideas, and that can block your thinking in a lot of ways.
Yes, and in the real intense political circles, I'm not sure if it's like this in Mexico. I don't know much about Mexican politics, but in the U.S., in the real intense circles, you totally demonize your enemies. I mean, it's more than just a disagreement of ideas. You look at the other side as immoral in some way. And
the in-group and the out-group.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
The out-group is seen as like less human in some cases.
Yes, and if one of your friends switch sides on you, and you may not be their friend anymore, and it's that a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, I used to be in like communities like that, and it definitely, like a lot of, especially reading these about ideological totalism, like a lot of it definitely I think resonates with what's going on politically today. Even like all these like it being permissible to like deplatform someone who you disagree with, or to try to get them off of social media, or even to like use violence against them. And it seems like attempts at milieu control, demand for purity, and in a certain way, like dividing people into people who are the good people or solid people, and people who are like the people that must be like silenced or in some way destroyed. Maybe not destroyed physically, but destroyed.
Like we have to win, and they have to lose.
Like ejected from the public sphere, I guess.
Yes, you're right on. I think.
Do you consider the military kind of like a cult, or no?
No, I mean they use during boot camp when they're trying to break you down and build you back up. A lot of the techniques are very similar to what cults do, but the military is very upfront about what they're trying to do, and you go in there knowing that, and there's a graceful way to leave at the end of your enlistment. So there's a lot of non-cult-like things about the military. Gotcha. They don't demonize people outside, stuff like that.
So I just wanted to interject another perspective on cults. I think maybe another thing that sets apart cults from just kind of regular sort of ideological behavior, this kind of, our team, their team, let's have our in-group, sort of thing. That and a cult is, cults tend to be these psychopathic. It's like psychopathic organizations. And what I mean by that is, like, I read this book called The Psychopath Code, which is really good. And it's about how psychopaths will, like there's a certain, small percentage of the human population that is just basically predatory on other humans. And so what these predators do is they find organizations that they can join, and they can like sit on top of and suck all of the resources out of. And then what happens is the organization itself kind of becomes psychopathic, and anybody new who joins the organization gets kind of their life force just like sucked out of them by the psychopaths who, and of course the new psychopaths that join the organization quickly work their way up the ranks to the top. And then they can kind of, work with the other psychopaths who are leading the organization to kind of feed off of everybody else. And I think in sort of a more benign organization, you don't see psychopathic behavior in the leaders, or at least you don't see it as much. But I think this is another reason why cults tend to be kind of small groups, because it's really hard to do this at scale. Unless you're I guess maybe like a large corporation or a government or something like that. Or North Korea. North Korea seems to be the largest cult that I can think of.
Well, that's kind of what all corrupt governments do to a certain extent, isn't it? Like you have someone at the top or leading some branch of it who's like sucking resources out.
Generally, yeah, that's how they work. But, well, as we've said with, I guess, other organizations, even horrible organizations, the people, the general population feels like it's benefiting them. So that's why it sticks around.
It's interesting you mentioned the personalities, though, because there was a study done on our group and the Unification Church and a couple of others afterwards. And the people that did the study based it on the Myers-Briggs, the different personality types in the Myers-Briggs. And what they did, they interviewed people that were in, people who had left, about, and they asked them what type they were before they joined and what type they were while they were in, and that type of thing. And what they found was that people in our group they all gravitated toward becoming ESFJ, which is emotional, sensing, feeling, and judging.
Extroverted sensing.
Extroverted, yeah. Extroverted, sensing, feeling, and judging. And which is like the personality type for the ultimate salesperson, which was the perfect personality for our group to further the cause of the group.
So you said people sort of gravitated towards that personality after joining?
They did, because they had asked them what their personality was like before joining and what they aspired to be while they were in, how they would have answered these questions while they were in, and they gravitated toward that personality type. In our group, you were not so subtly praised for emulating your leaders in the way they looked and the way they dressed and the way they talked, because they were more successful in recruiting and getting more people in, getting more people saved than you were. So everybody was kind of moving toward this one personality type. It was creepy.
Did they find that there was any correlation or like patterns in what types of personality types tended to be attracted to the group in the first place?
They didn't at that point, but I'll tell you anecdotally, and this is something that I've just learned through 30 years of experience of being on the other end of answering these emails and talking to people, is, and it's my own personal experience. The family I grew up in, it was a loving family in many ways, but I had alcoholism in my family, and it was chaotic in many ways. And what I found is probably, it's a huge percentage of the people that I end up talking to that join these groups have something like that in their family and in their background. And the only thing I can figure is if your family of origin is a little bit chaotic and crazy, and there's some deception and lying and the things that go on in an alcoholic family or a family where there's drug addiction, you get into one of these groups where there's deception and manipulation and stuff, and it feels good. It kind of feels like home. And so and I've noticed the correlation because a lot of ex-cult members, end up going to adult children of alcoholics and some of these different support groups to help them recover. And so I do think there's things in your past that can help ready you to be a good candidate for one of these groups.
I guess maybe one quick question. John, earlier you brought up the concept of pre-cult personality. And I'm not totally sure what my question is, but that just really intrigued me. And I guess do you have any kind of additional thoughts on the relationship between, like psychologically, between the person that someone is before they join the cult and this personality that you're talking about, this ESFJ tending personality that they tend to build while they're in the cult, and then what happens after?
Well, I guess I'll try to, let me know if I'm not answering your question, but when I talk about the pre-cult personality, and that's when I do meet with people that are still in the group in voluntary interventions, that's the person I'm trying to access. And I'm basing the assumption that the person is still there that cared about her friends outside the group, and the person's still there that, loves her family dog and still has a connection with her grandma and her dad and still cares about, basketball or writing or music or whatever she cared about before she joined. And that's always proven to be true, just through experience, that it's almost a beautiful thing when you see somebody come out of one of these groups, because the cult personality sort of gets layered on. It's almost like they're running malware. And it's they're talking and they're happy and they're upbeat and they're this and that and they're rah-rah cult. But when you see them come out of it, you see the real them again, and I didn't get to see the real them before because I'm usually meeting them for the first time, but it's usually in a family setting, and it's powerful because the person is back there that they were, and it provides a lot of hope to me. It's very hopeful that no matter how powerful these groups are, they can't really do permanent damage. They can't take who you are away. So not sure if I answered your question or not, but that's what I was talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was good. Do you feel like when people adopt these ideologies and get into this kind of groupthink that it does maybe it happens so fast that it's not fully integrated into their personality, but like you said, it's just kind of this layer on top?
Maybe, that's the way I've looked at it. And that's just a model I've worked from when I've talked to people that are still in, that it just helps me to remember when I'm talking to them and they're coming back at me with profanity or telling me I'm the devil or I'm a deprogrammer or I'm this or that, that I know that's not really them. It's who they've become in the group, and I look at it as really just, like I said, it's malware running on top of the real person. And just it helps me to have compassion for them even when they're swearing at me.
Yeah, I can see that. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, for coming on, Dad. I really appreciate you sharing your experience and all this information. I learned a lot, and I think it could be helpful for people.
I enjoyed it too, and I enjoyed meeting your friends. And I want to know when your other podcasts are, because you guys are interesting. I'm going to listen to them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching this episode. We hope that you learned a lot and found this information beneficial, and hopefully this will help if people are caught in any situations like this in the future. I just wanted to add as a final note, if anybody did have a friend or family member or was concerned themselves, the organization that my dad volunteers with is called Free Minds, and the website is freemindsinc.org. They're just a small group of kind people in Minnesota who like talking to people about these things to help them question if they're in a totalist ideology. So thank you. Thank you for joining us on The Multiversity. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.